Welcome back. This is a video reply to a viewer that asked an excellent question about lore checks. We had watched a game together where most of the game was an exposition dump. It was a lore check, the resolution of a lore check. It took a long time. And so the question came up, well, how would you handle lore checks? And asking me, an aggressive role player, one who likes to stay in character as much as possible. Well, how do you handle that? What about knowledge checks or arcana, nature, religion? You know what I'm talking about, those knowledge skills. How do you handle that in the game and try to do that in an in-character frame? Well, this is a question from Malacebad. It's an excellent question. It was brought to my attention by others who read it, saying, hey, that is a good question. Can we get some color on that? And I'm happy to answer this one because it does come up quite often. What is the answer? Do we just ignore knowledge checks or history checks? No, I don't think you can. I think that you have to have those as part of the game. And obviously there's going to be a disconnect that arises between what the player knows and what their character knows. And of course, I'm interested in staying in what the character knows, not what the player knows. So it's not ideal if you were to say, well, let's say we're playing in a setting that has an established canon, and all that's required then is a knowledge check from the character so that the player can apply the knowledge they have of that setting that has been published for decades, maybe Greyhawk or a Forgotten Realms or whatever. All of those published settings have significant amounts of information that really ambitious players may have read, but let's face it, most haven't. And then that kind of breaks down too, doesn't it? Because what if I'm playing a character that knows more than I know? How would I handle that? Well, that's a big problem. So you can't rely on player knowledge for this. You also may run into a bit of a difficulty if what you do is you say that all knowledge checks, all that I would say as a GM, if a player makes a successful knowledge check, is I would just say, yeah, successful knowledge check. Then I just let the player state what that knowledge is. Puts a huge amount of creative pressure on the player, wouldn't it? Oh, well, yes, the history of this is... Well, not everyone can just think on their feet like that. And this raises another problem. What happens if more than one player makes a successful knowledge check on the same subject? And they're both creating that? What if there's a distinct and identifiable conflict between their descriptions? Both were successful. How can they... So you can see that there's inconsistencies that may arise if the player characters have full license to create lore based on a successful check. Not a big deal if they fail the check, of course, then it could be erroneous information, or maybe they just don't know anything about that topic. So I don't think that you can just go all in co-creation for when it comes to history checks. My preference, and to answer your question, would be a hybrid approach. Perhaps it's best for me to give you an example. An example of this would be, let's say the player comes across some strange carvings in a room. Player says, in character, I study the strange symbols, thinking back to my time in the academy. Okay, that's enough. That in my mind is way better than, hey, Crispy, what do I know about strange symbols? What do I know about these? Do I recognize these? I'd rather not have those kind of questions in the game. So, back to the example. I study the strange symbols, thinking back to my time in the academy. The GM then may decide that requires a roll, or perhaps it doesn't. Maybe the symbols would be known for this character, given their background or their skill set or training. But let's say that a check is required. Well, in that case, the GM just calls for the check. Player makes the check, announces the result. Let's say the result is success. Because failed lore checks, no big deal, right? Bizarre. Novel. Not resembling, doesn't resemble anything known. That's easy. But let's say it's successful. Well, then we got a bit of a problem, right? How do I get this information to the player? Well, I don't think we have to overthink it too much. I would simply say a precursor language to Dwarven. Okay. Hey, get the dwarf over here. Maybe the dwarf doesn't need to make a check. Let's say I go along that and I say it tells of a war. This script, right, tells of a war against an ancient enemy called the Aboleth. That's all. That doesn't go into a large. Well, then you say to me, well, Crispy, what if I want to know if I know anything about Aboleth? Just repeat the same thing. Aboleth. I've heard of that before, I think. Where did I hear that? Talking to themselves, or maybe talking to another party member. GM says, roll, whatever, dungeoneering, arcana, I don't care, whatever. Whatever one is appropriate for the game you're playing. Let's say he's successful. Well, then I would just say an aquatic creature of the deep, known for manipulating biology, a creature of myth and terror that subjugates its victims to its alien will. Now, here is where you have to use your discretion. Too much description is just too much. Too little, and why make the check at all? You have to know the right line. Now, that might differ according to how successful the check was, or maybe the complexity of the system might have some influence on that. But I don't think that it's an invitation for you GMs, as verbose as you and I would like to be, to just regale the players with minutes after minute after minute of block text or anything like that. No, just state clearly, with an economy of language, what is known. The reason why I'd say this is a bit of a hybrid approach is because I also think that when it comes to lore checks, your session 0 is important. Now, I don't use session 0 very much for social contract stuff. That's for me, session 0 is about world building. And the reason why that's important when it comes to lore checks is because it establishes a baseline understanding that all of the players will have because they were there when the world was created. And it might be as simple as saying, hey, we're going to play in Eberron. Well, yeah, what's about Eberron? What is it like? I have an example of this I can share with you. I played in a vampire game. Haven't played in many vampire games. In fact, I've only played in one. This is a game set in modern-day Las Vegas. Can't say I'm very familiar with Las Vegas. So we spent that session 0 talking about what's Las Vegas like? Like, what's it really like? That's me establishing base lore. So that most of those questions, especially superficial questions, were answered already. My character exists as a kindred in Las Vegas. He already knows things. Let's use session 0 to establish what he knows. Now, we're not going to cover everything. There are still maybe things that come up that will be foreign to me, and I might have to make a check on that. But many things will be covered, especially if we spend our time wisely and ask good questions. What is the relationship between the kindred and this? Or tell me about Las Vegas. What's it like at night, especially on strip, off strip? What's the reputation? What's the public transit like? Where I want to know all of these things. So use your session 0 to establish that baseline to answer many lore checks before they even come up. You can also use that to set some parameters as far as what is in the domain of the player to create. For example, it might be entirely possible for a player to invent the clan history of their tribe. Maybe a family history is fine, or maybe you'd go so far as to let the player create where they came from, their homeland. And history checks related to their homeland, you make the check still. Game Master will say success or failure, and then the player will just create on the spot what it is, the history of their own land. I've already mentioned how I think that breaks down if it's on every lore check, But I think in certain areas it works very well, especially as it pertains to the player character background. So this was a great question. It does come up quite a bit. How do you handle this? That's how I handle it. I hope this has been informative. Thank you again to Malicebad for asking the question. I like your questions. Please keep them coming, and I'll catch you guys next time. I'm going to stop the video right now.